If you ever thought, Catan is all luck, why do I lose all my games? How do I get better? Well, this video will give you the roadmap to improve your game and climb the ranks the next 30 days, even if you're a complete beginner. Much like chess, a game of Catan can be separated into phases: the placement and expansion phase, the middle game, and the end game. So number one, the placement. In Catan, you start the game with a colossal choice in terms of strategy: your initial settlement. It's again similar to chess, where your opening is critical. Where you place will determine what resources you produce and how much of them, which will affect the next stages of the game. So here are the 4 main principles to keep in mind when deciding where to place your initial settlement. Production. This is an integral aspect of Colonist. When you have 2 dice, some numbers are more likely to roll than others, simply because there are more combinations to get that number. 2 and 12 are the rarest because you can only get them with 2 1s or 2 6s respectively. And the rest of the numbers look something like this. If you look at a Colonist board, you'll see pips under the numbers. These show how many production points each number has. After 7s, which aren't on any hex because they moved the robber, 8s and 6s have the highest production, 5 pips. So at its most basic form, you want to maximize the number of pips you place on. If you think this is super basic, worry not, we're going to get much deeper in a second. The next thing to think about is resources. Simply maximizing production is not a sufficient strategy because you might be lacking in other aspects of your game. For this reason, you have to look at the rarity of a certain resource as well as how it coordinates with the rest of your setup. If a resource is rare, you might want to gravitate towards it because it will give you an advantage over the rest of the board. If ore is rare and you produce the most, you might be able to take army. Also, if you produce a lot of a rare resource, it can give you a lot of flexibility when it comes to trades. Other people may be willing to give you their materials for your scarce resource.
Take a look at this board from the US Catan Championship final. Pause the video and think of where you'd place. Most people would likely go for the 6-4-10. Good production and strong setup for development cards. However, Dandy Drew ended up placing on the 8-5-10 and became the main producer of wheat. He then used this position to trade with others. He also made a strong use of ports, which we'll talk about in a second. Dandy Drew ended up winning the championship, and it was, in part, because he focused on a rare resource.
You also want to keep in mind how your resources coordinate and work with each other. If you have 12 points of production on your initial settlement on ore and wheat, it might not make sense to go for a lot of brick in your second settlement, even though it might be a lot of production. If possible, in this case, you want to look for a spot with sheep, which will coordinate with your other resources to give you development cards in this case. By the way, if you like these tips, make sure to subscribe. There's a lot of content coming your way soon. Next thing to think about is expansion spot. We need to place thinking about how we're going to expand our setup. Your setup might be extremely solid in isolation, but it might not let you expand to new places or get cities to increase your production. You have to think of what your plan will be once the game actually starts. As we'll see in a second, the middle game really starts when setups are consolidated, so you should have a plan of how to expand as efficiently and as quickly as possible. And you should have a plan to do that, whether it is with a city or with an early settlement that you can get to, ideally with just one road. The last thing to think about in terms of settlements is roads. A good amount of thought should go into what way to place your starting roads. These are valuable resources that the game gives you for free, so you don't want to waste those and lose your momentum. You might want to get greedy and go for a juicy spot with a lot of production, but if you think it through, you might see that it's most likely going to get taken and that road will be wasted. That's why, as you might have heard, it's often a safe bet to point your road towards a port. Now, this works even better if that's a 2-1 port for a material that you produce in abundance. Ports can give you a lot of flexibility in later stages of the game because if there's a material that you don't produce that much of, you can use your abundance of another material to get it instead. This makes you more independent and less reliant on trades, which can come in handy if you're ahead and people don't really want to trade with you. And one last thing about roads that's a little more niche, and I see even top players missing this sometimes. As you know, your second settlement gives you whatever materials it's touching to start with. So if you place on a hex that has wood and brick, you'll basically start with a free road. Oftentimes, this free road can be huge. It can help you raise someone to a spot you both want, or even plow them, which is when you cut them off with the road. Phase 1.2, expansion. Once you've placed, the game starts. Congratulations. Now, what do you do? Well, it goes back to the first thing we discussed. Production. Your early efforts in the game should usually be directed towards increasing your production. And that might be through strong settlement expansion spots or, most likely, cities. Cities are huge. Think about it. Let's say you have a strong spot with 12 pips of production. Getting a city makes you get 2 cards every time one of those numbers roll, increasing your production to 24 pips. Of course, as we've discussed, production isn't everything. There might be a point where you can get an expansion spot that gives you a crucial resource you need, or maybe a 2-1 port that unlocks your game. But basically, in the early stages of the game, focus on consolidating your setup and increasing production to build momentum for the later phases. Unless absolutely necessary, shy away from mass purchasing development cards or starting any road races. Stage 2, the middle game. The middle game essentially starts when you're done with your evident expansion spots. Maybe you've placed a city and a settlement spot and now you're a production machine. Now, the burning question in the middle game is, what are you going to do with all this production? You might want to build on a port to have flexibility with trading, or you might want to start fighting for road or army. And here, the concept of pacing takes on an important role. Pacing is essentially leveling out with the board. No one is too far ahead and you don't stick out as the obvious target. As Colonist legend Dandy Drew mentioned in one of our latest videos, you can pace on points, which is the obvious one, you can pace on production, which is what we've discussed, and you can of course pace on a win condition. This means that how much you invest in getting road or army will depend on how far ahead others are. So you might have a situation where you can either build a city or get 1 or 2 development cards, and that decision might be educated if you're pacing for a win condition. Of course, in an actual game, it's way murkier than this. Someone might have gotten some early development cards, or you might have had to buy some early roads to not 7 out. Basically, just take these as concepts and not strict rules. The middle game is also where the bulk of the trades will happen in a game. To get the best deals possible, the best thing you could do is trade out of your turn. But you have to do so strategically. During your turn, you likely have to overpay for cards you could get during someone else's turn. And the way you accomplish these trades is by tracking. Tracking is following what cards people are getting and which ones they're missing to build the things they need. Tracking is what you should be doing during other people's turns, and it comes with practice. But 2 ways to get a sense of another player's hand is 1, to look at the chat log to see what has rolled, and 2, to see what trades they're asking for. If you have a strong sense of someone's hand, you might be able to ask for a trade that benefits you a lot during their turn, something you wouldn't be able to get away with during your turn. Someone might give you 2 cards for 1, for example. Lastly, once you've identified your win condition, you can try to hurt other players going for that same win condition, or make sure the other win conditions are contested as well. For example, you could help another player get development cards so there's a second player fighting for army. This will basically manage the board's pacing and make sure no one sneaks away with the win while you're fighting the others to a win condition. Phase number 3, the end game. The end game is where it becomes pretty clear what your 1 to 2 ways to win, aka win conditions, are. This means that if you're paying attention, you likely also know what your opponent's win conditions are. And given that this is the case, it's probably the stage where tracking becomes the most important. Tracking is crucial in the end game because where to place the robber becomes critical. Who you block or who you steal from could quite literally prevent someone from winning or give you the win. Tracking is not only important to follow other people's cards, but also the development card deck. The better your sense of what development cards have been played throughout the game, the more you'll be able to know what other people might have and adjust accordingly. Not only that, but it could give you an idea of whether the deck is hot, as people say. If the deck is hot, it means that there's a high ratio of strong cards in the cards that remain. So maybe there's less than 10 development cards left, but there are 2 victory points, a road building, and 2 monopolies. Depending on where your game is at, you might want to go for development cards in this case. Alternatively, if you know that all or most of those cards have been played already, you know that the deck mostly contains knights, and unless you're fighting for army, you're probably better off investing those resources elsewhere. Alright, we've covered a lot of ground, so let's break down the main takeaways for each stage of the game. For placing and expanding, production. Aim to place settlements on hexes with high production. Resource coordination. Maximize the synergy between the resources you produce. For example, pairing ore and wheat for city. Expansion spots. Plan your future expansions from the start. Ensure that your placement allows for quick and efficient expansions, ideally with minimal roads. Road strategy. Use your starting roads wisely by imagining where everyone else could place. Also, take advantage of free road setups when possible. The middle game. Pacing. Make sure you're keeping up with the board and no one is running away with a win condition. Tracking. Monitor opponents' hands by tracking dice rolls and trades. Trades. Aim to trade outside your turn for better deals. The end game. Win condition. Identify your 1 to 2 win conditions and aim to achieve them while hurting other people's chances. Robber placement. Pay close attention to opponents' resources and development cards to block key hexes. Development card deck. Assess the remaining development cards to decide whether to invest in them or not. And that's all I got. If you liked the video, make sure to subscribe and comment what your favorite strategies are.